This kind of ability for you to kind of peek behind the anime and see the realism is really a wonderful part of our games.
こだわってきました。
Persona.
ゲームの冒頭の
So for Persona 3, probably my favorite scene is the opening. There's an opening animation where the protagonist is walking through shadow time, which is a sort of unique time in the game itself. And he's surrounded by coffins and he just does not care. He's walking through this whole area listening to his music. And I think that's really symbolic and kind of sums up the entirety of Persona. And I really enjoy it. First of all, he wanted everybody to listen to Shoji Meguro's music. That was one of the kind of goals of that scene. But also, it was very symbolic and representative of the game as a whole. It kind of showed the contrast between the player themselves and the world that they're in. There's this kind of dark world that a lot of dark things happen in this world of Persona 3. But there's this pop UI and there's this kind of poppy feel. So that kind of contrast really highlights a key aspect of Persona 3. And additionally, you're sort of comparing the difference between the world inside the player's head and the real world that he lives in, or the many characters live in. So there's that kind of, once again, another contrast, another difference that we're kind of highlighting with this scene. And rather than saying it's not really exactly my absolute favorite scene, but it is for me kind of where the entire story and development of Persona 3 started at this kind of moment. So I think it's really important to me.
ゲミさん長くてごめんなさい。
You're late. I've been waiting a long time for you.
Yosuke っていうキャラクターが
So in Persona 4, this happens really early in the game, but it's the first time the protagonist and the other characters go to visit this other world. There's this scene, and I'm not really sure if this is like the best thing for me to kind of pull up, especially on an interview, but like there's a character named Yosuke, and he really just has to go to the bathroom. He can't hold it in. I'm not sure if it would be my favorite scene, but when you asked me to kind of think of the first scene that I remembered from Persona 4, that was the first thing that popped into my mind.
I can't hold it anymore!
We'd come off of Persona 3, which was a really, really dark story. So we wanted 4 to be a little bit less dark. When we were designing the world there, we were kind of thinking that one way that we could really kind of try to enhance this or try to really kind of separate it from that Persona 3 as well is to really focus on the reality of the world and the reality of the characters and the reality of the situation and the setting that they're in. As part of this kind of focusing on what makes our characters feel real and feel human, was this kind of toilet scene. Another kind of good example of this is there's a character called Nanako. The main character is kind of staying at another kind of house, and there's this little girl named Nanako there.
Dad has to go do something. He got a call, so he left.
And when we were first writing all of her dialogue, we wrote them to be really, really, really cute.
Every day's great at your Junas.
And we kind of like took a step back and we thought, wait a minute, all of her lines are so cute and they're so like well done that it doesn't feel like any actual human girl would say at that age. It just felt like too much. So what we tried to do is we went in and we started kind of cutting back on those kind of overly cutesy dialogues and trying to kind of root her dialogue once again in more reality. And so even though Persona 4 is a modern fantasy game, we wanted it to feel more closer, more like something that could be happening, next door to you. A really representative scene that kind of represented this was that Yosuke having to go to the bathroom scene. We had a background to Yosuke. We knew who he was. We had this kind of whole family setting. We had all this kind of realism that we tried to impart into the character. But at the same time, we wanted players to interact with him, to grow to like him, to see that he wasn't just kind of the idyllic, perfect, sidekick character, but instead he was a character with his own story, his own kindness, his own weaknesses, his own kind of flaws. And then through the story, he could overcome them. So it was this kind of, rather than once again trying to kind of calculate exactly what would make this the perfect version, we were just thinking, oh, this scene would be pretty cool to like kind of maybe bring out his more human side. And oh, this moment would be it feels really good, just kind of added a little bit of humor. And then this one would be really interesting for the more realistic side as well. So make this realistic character that kind of had these ups and downs, this kind of gap in his personality.
What is this place? Some place inside Juness?
Hell no, it isn't. I mean, we fell through a TV.
So yeah, I think the gap between the kind of realism of the characters themselves and the kind of anime visuals and the anime aesthetic of the game is a really interesting and important part of the game, for sure. Definitely the player who like kind of first looks at the game and sees this very anime style kind of characters in this kind of anime style world will then maybe get surprised and very interested to see that there's this very real underpinning to them. So I think that's really important. This kind of ability for you to kind of peek behind the anime and see the realism is really a wonderful part of our games.
こだわってきました。
Hey, where'd you go? Snap out of it.
キャサリンはやっぱり
There's this kind of relaxing mattari feel, which is a very maybe chilling would be a good way to impart in English. So you can kind of hang out and talk to the customers. You can talk to the kind of bar master, the bartender, and just kind of relax. And I feel like that really just is like the perfect atmosphere for the game. I'm not really a drinker, I would have to say. I don't really, because I'm not a drinker, I don't go to bars and kind of hang out there very often. But it is this kind of dream, this fantasy that I have to, there's, for people who enjoy drinking, there's that one bar down the street that you always go to and just kind of chill out and everybody knows your name, right? So it's not like you're going there to find solutions or to overcome major parts of your life. You're just kind of going there to chill and relax. And so rather than it being based on any actual events or any conversations I've had, it's this kind of imaginary, idealistic bar image that I have in my brain that was kind of very much in there. In the Persona series, we talked a lot about teenagers and about the problems that they have as teenagers, thinking about, okay, what am I going to be doing when I'm an adult? What am I going to be doing? And this kind of conflict that each character has about their lives. But one thing I thought we wanted to achieve in Catherine was that, conflict isn't like all this kind of anxiety and conflict isn't limited to teenagers. It's very present in adults as well.
Sounds to me like she finally wants you to tie the knot.
Do I get married? Do I take another path in life? What do I do with my life? It's something that we always ask ourselves at any age in our life. So one of the things that we thought would be really interesting to cover with Catherine was, okay, we have this character. What if we made this character who, had been seeing a girlfriend for a long time, and the girlfriend asked him, do you want to get married? And it's a really big turning point, a really big decision for him. So I thought that would be a really interesting way to kind of talk about this. Like everybody has conflicts in their life and has things that they, are worried about. And, it was really kind of just a spur of the moment, like energetic, just like, let's just go with this kind of vibe.
という感じでしたね、キャサリンは。これでいろんなシーン思い入れあるんですけど。
So for Persona 5, there are a huge number of scenes that I would love to talk about, and a huge number of scenes that I think a lot of people have also enjoyed playing the game. But the thing is, I want to avoid spoilers, so I don't want to talk about any of these very in-depth story scenes. But if I'm going to talk about a scene that doesn't involve spoilers, I would say it's not really a scene so much as just a location, but the hideout that the characters in Persona 5, the place that they're where they hang out, is for me just really, it's probably my favorite part. Just something about that location just really appeals to me. And I think it took us a long time to actually settle on that as our location for the game. So that also is a really good memory for me.
Of course! This is where you belong, Mona!
So I think in Persona 5, a lot of the characters don't really have a place where they feel safe. So I wanted to find a place where they can go and just really have that sense of security. In Shibuya, it's really kind of hard to find that sort of location. There's lots of roads, lots of corridors, but there's not really a place where society will be like, okay, you guys can just sit here and chill out and just use it as your kind of base. I think a lot of finding that place that they're welcome is really difficult. And probably there are people out there who have found those locations as well within Shibuya. But for the characters in Persona 5, what I was trying to think about finding a place where they would be welcome. And I came up with the idea of what we call in Japan a junkisa, which is a sort of old style cafe. And these are they tend to be really retro. They are always really retro. They're these kind of old school vibes. And the food they put out, the kind of vibes are all really like, it's tasty, it's cool, but it's kind of, their time has passed and they've begun to fade with time. There's not quite as many of them around anymore. But I thought, what if we chose this location? It would be a really interesting place to have these characters find their place. And it would also what if we put all this random stuff in there as well to make it feel like kind of like not a storehouse, but a place to store things. It would also be really kind of an interesting vibe as well. So that was kind of maybe what we were aiming for.
的にはちょっとそういう風に狙って作ったっていうのがあります。
One has to ask, them dead, who shall take the throne?
So maybe this isn't my favorite scene, but it's for me, the most representative or the best way to show what Metaphor is the journey scenes. So in the game, you kind of journey from location to location, from town to town. And when you reach a new location, when you kind of get out of your transport and kind of see this new area, for me, at these moments were the moments that really brought it home to me that I'm not making a modern day RPG. I'm making something different. I'm making something fantasy. And I think that really felt good.
The gauntlet runner arrives at the Gracia forest, temperate and fertile. It was once a place of repose, where the songs of fairies echoed throughout.
So I think a lot of people who are fans of our work are kind of used to the sort of games that we make, and the games that we've made, for example, Persona 3, Persona 4, Catherine, and so on. But people who are, fans of this and kind of looking forward to our next work, probably we thought they would get really excited when they heard, wait, Atlus is making a fantasy game? We wanted to make a fantasy game that felt like something that only Atlus could create. And it's kind of odd to say this because fantasy isn't really a new genre in the industry. For example, a company that made lots of fantasy games made another fantasy game. It would be like, oh yes, they're making another fantasy game. But we're hoping for people to think, wait, Atlus is making a fantasy game? I am really curious to see what sort of game that will be. For me, that kind of is something that really only we could do. It's this unique kind of for people to see the unique kind of atmosphere that we could bring to a fantasy game. Because it's our first attempt, our first entry into the fantasy game genre. This is something that I personally feel, and maybe this is really maybe a boring kind of small example, but for me, when you arrive in a new town, this is something that you do in a billion games. You go to a new town, you set up a new hub, you kind of get to know the place. And it's not like we're doing anything new with this whole system, but for us, it's our first time doing it. So it's a sort of thing that you would take for granted in another game. You walk into a new town, oh, it's a new hub. But for us, we put this really emotional, sentimental, oh, you're in a new area. And we're hoping that sort of fresh look at it, that kind of newness, that excitement about challenging something new, and that excitement about seeing something new that in a fantasy game that we felt, because it was our first time doing it, something that the players who've maybe done this in a lot of times before will come up for them when they play this game and kind of go to these new places.
とは今願ってます。